here as a center to try to serve the University of St. Thomas, the Graduate School of Theology here at the Seminary, the Archdiocese, the ecumenical community, and the civic community of Houston. And we feel that we are doing something quite unique here. And in what we are trying to accomplish, it has implications for all of those groups. The center remains highly ecumenical in spirit, and we're thankful for the Presbyterian representative here today, and John Wilson as well. And also, we are very much focused on in the religious dialogue with the Jews and Muslims in the Houston area, and you may know that from the conference that we just had. But our basic mission statement is this: the Center for Faith and Culture seeks to understand and affect. So we don't want to just have an understanding of the American way of life, but we want to affect the relationship between the worldview of Catholic faith and culture. It specifically desires to study the vision and values, the symbols and codes of the gospel embodied in Catholic teaching, and then relate these to the dominant American way of life. In this way, it will develop an appreciation. Now get this, appreciation. Apprécier in French means to put an appropriate price on something, to give it its proper value, okay? Apprécier, okay, you're going to give it its proper value. You're going to see the good in it. You'll also see the challenges that it presents. You'll see the weaknesses. You'll see what has to be made up in this particular way of life. In this way, it will develop an appreciation of the dominant American culture. I can explain that for you in a moment. Some people think we don't have an American culture. We have subcultures all over the place. We do have the subcultures. We have diversity of cultures within the United States, but there is one dominating way of life that manifests itself principally in paying taxes. And you're going to say, well, how is that? Well, the taxes really incorporate so many of the values and the vision of our participation in this way of life as Americans. We can come back to that. In this way, it will develop an appreciation of the dominant American culture, both in its strengths and in its weaknesses, in light of the gospel. We'll also study the encounter of the dominant American culture with three of its major cultural groupings: African American, Asian, and Hispanic. Okay? So basically, what we're talking about here is the encounter between the Christian message, the gospel, and this way of life that we lead as Americans. So what I would like to do with you now is say something about that and work up to the title of this particular workshop that we're going through this week. When we talk about a culture, what are we talking about? We're talking about a way of life and a window on the world that is shared by people, a community, a group, a society, a nation. It's not my little individual world. It is something which we share. So what do we share? We share a vision. A vision about what? Well, in one way or another, about if there is a God, or isn't there a God, or is there a God, what the God is like. Number one. Number two, it also incorporates something about how we understand ourselves. How do you understand a human being in this way of life? And the third thing is, how do we understand the world that we relate to? This is our vision. This is our window on the world. Okay? We view a world differently than would the Maasai, for instance, in Africa, or the Eskimos, or the Italians, or the Chinese, or the Vietnamese. We have a different window on the world in the way we understand it. By vision, I mean where we're going. What's our destiny? What do we seek by way of happiness? What will make us happy? What makes us sad? All of those kinds of things. The third thing, flowing from the vision and where we're going, is what we value. What do we give the greatest importance to? What are our priorities? And start thinking about that as Americans. We'll get into this a little bit more deeply in a moment. The next thing that a way of life, a vision of the world, a window on the world contains is the expected patterns of behavior that are inherent in our daily life. How do I expect you to behave, and how do you expect me to behave in the way we live? We expect you to pay your taxes. We expect you to obey the speed signs, the speed limits. We know that there are certain lines that you don't cross as you relate to each other as people. We have certain ways of behaving in carrying out business transactions. We have certain ways of behavior that are expected in families, and so forth and so on. Now you can say, hey, whoa, this is really in flux in our way of life right now. We used to be able to expect that it would be a man and a woman, for instance, who would be related in the institution of marriage. Well, that's up for question. We used to have role definitions for a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, and how they would interact in a family. Those have changed. These are always in flux, okay? And finally, the kinds of symbols that we have that signify what we value. So everything comes from the vision, goes towards where we're going in our life. It shapes what we value. It shapes the way we behave with each other. And ultimately, it shapes the symbols that we use to embody this vision that we have. Whether it's the Statue of Liberty, whether it's a flag, whether it's a handshake, whatever these symbols may be. We have certain symbols. Okay, where do we get this culture? Well, we inherit it. But is it static? No, it is not static. Each generation has to take it and live it and look at it and can shape it and give it new form and new direction. We have to engage as a people, as a society, reflecting on our way of life and what direction we want to give it. One of the major places that this happens is in our Congress. The Congress is a constant, ongoing dialogue about the American way of life. That's why it was set up. Thank God we have checks and balances. Thank God we are not a democracy. We are a republic. A democracy means that the majority rules. And you can swing majority on the basis of emotion. And you can come up with all kinds of wrong directions about what should be here in our way of life and so forth. Democracy can be ruled by hotheads, or it can be ruled by those who have no interest whatsoever in their way of life. But we are a republic, and that requires representation. And we can get into that. That's what I do in my course. Okay? So it's inherited, but it is reshaped. We have to shape. We have to take our responsibility for this way of life and give it some direction. So it's constantly undergoing change. Culture is not a static thing. Our way of life is not a static thing. And we have to participate in what kind of shape it is going to take. And finally, there is no culture without faith. There is no culture that does not have some form of a spirituality, whatever that takes. I mean, even after the French Revolution, when they wanted to throw out all of religion, they said there is no religion, but that became their religion. So there's a kind of faith, all right? Now, what is faith? Well, faith, and I put this down, I said, faith is the human receptive response of mind and heart to the truth of the self-revelation of God who is love. This is the first engagement of the human person. It's the most fundamental engagement, probably the most complete engagement of the person in response to God who reveals himself, herself as love. So it's an active response. It's the greatest gift that God has given us. This capacity to enter into relationship with God, who invites us to the relationship and graces us with his presence. What else is faith? This is a vision of truth. But the truth that faith envisages is the divine window on the world, how God sees things, what God expects, and where we find the ultimate truth about God, about the human person, and about the world, and how all three of these things relate. But beyond that, we also find in faith a sense of mission and destiny. And in faith, we also find the values flowing from it, which we could even say the Beatitudes are. The Beatitudes are the values, what we value by way of attitude and behavior in this understanding of faith. And finally, the expected patterns of behavior and also the symbols. So it's a way of life. Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Christ is the way to fulfilling the two deepest desires of the human person. The desire for truth and the desire for unending life. Christ is the way to that. So you have your vision, mission, values, norms of behavior, and symbols inherent in faith. It's inherited, but nonetheless it has to be deepened and embodied in every lived experience. And there is no faith without culture. Faith doesn't just exist out here like it's hanging, from God's hand by itself. Faith is always embodied in a way of life. You know that you live faith differently than Italians live faith, or Germans live faith, or Africans live faith, or Australians live faith, or Vietnamese live faith. One of the greatest gifts I have been given is to have had experience almost all of those cultures, and to go in there and be there and try to receive the way they live the faith out according to their expected patterns of behavior, according to their vision of the world, and so forth. So we have to keep that in mind. There is no faith without culture, and there is no culture without faith. Now, the one thing that I have said to you is this. I forgot to say to you. Cultures are human constructs. Therefore, cultures are as limited as the people who create them. So they're always going to be limited. Any culture always has blinders. It can't get the entire vision. It only sees part of it. And it needs a revelation. It needs a divine revelation to give an understanding of something that is broader than that way of life. So what's Christian spirituality? Christian spirituality, for a Christian, to live a spiritual life means to live the life in the Spirit. Both of this God who is indwelling us and God who is beyond us, okay? We live with a living God who is love. Love which is both above us, transcendent, and within, immanent. And what the spiritual life is seeking, and the only thing that spiritual life seeks, is union with God in love and union with other people in love. It seeks community. It seeks communion. It seeks communio. So the whole of the spiritual life
is focused on nothing but becoming loving people. And everything that is that implies, from the God who is love and reveals himself and invites us to that love, which is the only thing which will satisfy us in our deepest longings. Let me say a couple of words about inculturation and evangelization. Inculturation is nothing more than taking the faith, love, and making it incarnate. The incarnation of Christ, Jesus, the Word of God, becoming flesh, is what tells us how we have to take faith and make it become flesh in our daily ways of life. That is what it means to be inculturated. It's a fancy term. It's an anthropological term. It's a term which we try to say, okay, now this love has to penetrate this way of life of Americans. And how is that going to happen? How is that going to happen? It means to bring the good news or the master story as a critique for everything. And it is only done, inculturation and evangelization only takes place through the divine power of the Word, which is love. And it's that love which has to penetrate all of the levels of the cultural psyche. Now you know what this means. It means this is an everyday, ongoing process which requires tremendous awareness, which requires tremendous attention to how we live as Christians who are seeking to be people of love, to let love penetrate us, to let love penetrate the context in which we find ourselves. To take it to its extreme. What are the implications of love for all of these bioethical questions that are going on now? This is where push comes to shove. What are the implications about life that we have to penetrate the culture? Okay? There's no such thing as Christian culture today. There's no Christian culture. There is the Christian faith which we live in community. We have to be the leaven for our way of life. And we have to learn how to be a leaven which pervades the mass. But there is no Christendom, and there will never be a Christendom again. Some people think there will be. I mean, there was one university that calls itself Christendom University. Well, that's okay. But what are you going to become? Are you going to become one in the culture as Christ was? Or are you going to become a lifestyle community which reverts back to itself, puts up a wall, and wants to be enclosed where it's going to be pure? That ain't the way we live. We're never going to have a Christendom again. All right? We have to be there and understand how to live this way of life in the very life that we share with Americans. And that's why we are either community or a lifestyle enclave. This is why we have the great challenge of learning to live as faithful citizens. Citizens who are full of faith. That's a big challenge. You know that? And the bishops, American bishops, put out their letter before every presidential election, and they say, we want you to be faithful citizens. Ooh. Okay, that means you've got to really scrutinize these candidates. Whoa. Well, how do we do that? Well, what do you value? What's your vision of the world? What's your mission, your destiny? What are the expected patterns of behavior that flow from your faith? Is somebody going to respond to those? Are you going to be able to? Nobody's perfect. How do you do this? What do you weigh? This is where push comes to shove in the spiritual life. You really want to be a loving person? Yes. All these concrete situations and the implications of that. The encounter of faith and culture is us as not in us, not only as individual persons, but as community. So, we come here and we've entitled these series, this whole Spirituality Institute, as Come and Wash at the Pool of Siloam. So, it's taken from John 9, where Jesus goes over and he washes, he tells a guy that's born blind, he says, go down there and wash your eyes. Take the mud off. Okay. He goes and he says, I can see. Well, we're coming in here, we can see. I mean, I adjust my vision with these glasses. Some of us have a little better vision than others. Some don't have any vision at all. Sometimes I think I don't. Well, where do we get washed? We get washed at the pool of Siloam. We come here to let this vision of God help us to see things correctly and move. So, from the first year, and I'm coming to a conclusion now, Maureen. I'm getting nervous. All right. For the first, we have 5 summer institutes, and what we've tried to do is take some value inherent in the American cultural psyche and relate it to that same value in the gospel. Okay, for instance, number 1 value for Americans is freedom, right? Okay. How do we look at freedom and how is it understood in our American way of life? And what does the gospel have to say to us about that? That was our first one. The second one is, how do you handle suffering? How do you wrestle with suffering? How do you wrestle with suffering as an American, and how do you wrestle with suffering as a person of faith? Third one, absolutely critical for living the spiritual life. Can you hear me now? You know, we try to get these good titles. You know, Maureen and Cynthia and Father Ben are always the ones who come up with these. That's the one about the phones. You know, all the least drop calls. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah, but that's a kind of definition of how we respond to God. The least drop calls. We drop them. So we have here the awareness and paying attention. Then last year we did identity theft. This was a hot thing, wasn't it? And the challenges for Catholic Americans or Christians. And this year we're doing There Will Be Blood. And as we sat down for this, we thought, well, blood shedding. For life or for death? Why do we want to draw blood? Sometimes we feel like we're bleeding. Blood poured out, blood blisters, blood curdling, cold blood, hot blood, warm blood, bloodletting, leeches, blood types, bloodline. Who am I? Where do I get my life force? Whose blood? How much? For what? Paying debt? Does God demand blood? So our symbol for this time together is twofold. It's the Pie Pelicane, a symbol of the pelican who takes her blood and gives it to the chicks, becomes the symbol of Christ. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote a beautiful, beautiful hymn on that. Pie Pelicane Jesu Domine, me mundo sua sanguine. You, O Jesus, are the wonderful pelican who through your blood will cleanse me. Okay? And then we have the crucifix that Father Ben has put up. And by the way, Father Ben is our interior designer. He takes care of all of this, and he pulls little things out of his storehouse every once in a while to put them up, and he surrounds us with beauty. So, atonement or at-one-ment, blood shed or bloodshed? We're going to be looking at the cultural, scriptural, theological, and psychological. First of all, it contrasts the instinctual, as somebody said, with the human understanding of how you shed blood. And why is the blood shed? Is it for the self, or is it for the other? Under what conditions? How much of it is based on self-interest and self-indulgence over against self-donation, self-sacrifice? I think that's the tension that we are going to be struggling with in these 3 days. All of our presentations are going to address that particular question. Why do we do it? Why do people get confused between self-sacrifice and self-interest? Precisely, where does the gospel meet every culture when it comes to shedding
of blood. Father Ben, on the second day, or this afternoon, is going to begin that reflection on Christianity as the ultimate revelation about God's nature and man's destiny. That God becomes man, sheds blood, and then offers blood in the Eucharistic form. I think one thing, when you go here and you look at this, you can't approach the cup lightly again. You can't do it unfocused, and you can't look at it in such a way that it's just a ritual. So this leads to the necessity of understanding clearly what it means to be a citizen who is full of faith when it comes to an understanding of shedding blood. It also places here before us the challenge to understand the true meaning of evangelization. What is our role and what is our task to be ambassadors of reconciliation, as Paul says? How's this going to be carried out? So let's look a little bit at the American way of life. Let's look at American culture, which really shapes us in such a way that we look at self-interest, that we look at self-indulgence, rather than being immersed in the spirit for self-donation. Everybody recognizes that Americans place the highest premium on the individual. The individual precedes community. In every way of life, you're going to have this tension. How does the individual or the person relate to the whole? And how does the whole relate to the person? We think of it in terms of justice. In traditional scholastic theology, we talk about commutative justice, namely, what I owe you and what you owe me as individual people who would be in a contractual situation. We also have talked about distributive justice, what the society owes to the individual person. And in American culture, that is one of the most difficult things to discuss. What the government should be doing to see that the goods are distributed to people throughout. It comes down to this whole question of universal health care and so many other things. That would be putting it right smack there with where the rubber hits the road. How do we resolve that issue? On the one hand, the American mentality would say, well, each should take care of his own personal health care necessities. But is that really the way it should work? I only cite that to show you that in our mentality, the individual comes first. And that's not all so bad, you know. It's in our culture, we have raised up the value of the individual person. We have taken it and we've shined a light on it to show personal responsibility and the ability to give oneself direction, as opposed just to instinctual things with these animals that are killing each other out of instinct, the survival of the fittest. We don't act that way as individuals. We're supposed to live in society as individual persons. And the best way to make that distinction, of course, is between the individual and the person. We tend to think in American society as the isolated individual over here who only enters into society to the extent that it is going to benefit self-interest. Now, what does that do with the way we understand this necessity for giving the self for the others and coming to forgiveness and to reconciliation. If you're living on your own, why would you even have to think about reconciliation? Why is that reconciliation a bit difficult and sometimes even unnecessary in our own minds in this particular culture? Because individuals find themselves over against each other. Okay? We live in relativized worlds, are individualized worlds of operation, in which we are given to seek self-interest. We live in worlds unto themselves, enclosed worlds. One thing that the gospel wants to do is open us up. It doesn't want to get us closed in on ourselves. The other day, in a little homily I gave over St. Teresa, I began by saying, you know, it's not about me. It really isn't about me. But everything around us wants to tell us that it's about you, and it's about me. And therefore we spin around in our own little orbits, only think about what is going to benefit me. What this does is minimalizes the importance of relationship and also participation in civic, public discourse and public life, and turns us in on ourselves. So what this does for us is puts us in a situation where we are constantly negotiating individual rights and desires. If we come together, what we seek is conflict resolution rather than forgiveness and reconciliation. And everybody is looking to find out how you resolve conflicts between individual rights or group rights. Our culture does not heighten a sense of the necessity for mercy, for forgiveness, and for reconciliation. Mercy and reconciliation would be the last things that we tend to think about. We may think of forgiveness, but we would think of forgiveness only because if I don't forgive, then that's going to have a deleterious effect on me as a person. I've got to forgive. Okay, I forgive. Well, am I going to recognize? Am I going to reconcile? Wait. Then now reconciliation is a little bit too much to ask. And mercy, when somebody else doesn't deserve it, whoa. That's not what first and foremost comes into our mind by a cultural folk. You constantly move back in a cultural situation from mercy, back a step to reconciliation, back a step to forgiveness, back to conflict resolution, back to conflict management. So what the culture is actually doing is preventing us from moving outside of the self for the other, and the only way to resolve these conflicts sometimes is by shedding somebody else's blood. That's really what it comes down to. So, what we have here is a constant negotiation of individual rights and desires. So, what are some of the cultural habits of the heart? Robert Bellah always talks about culture, habits of the heart. What are mores? Well, unbridled desire for one thing. Whatever I desire is what I should have. And I should have every means to be able to achieve that. Whatever I'm feeling at the time, these are feelings that should be expressed, and these are feelings that should be satisfied. Put yourself back on yourself once again. The focus is on me. What it also does is puts us in a terrible context of competition. You see yourself not as participative now, but as competitive. And when we look at ourselves as competitive, as individuals, I'm here, I have my desires, I have my wants, I have my needs, and I will satisfy these. You have yours, so we find ourselves in one big competitive mix. In competition, again, does not lead to a mentality of reconciliation, of forgiveness, and ultimately of mercy. We live what René Girard and we live what Gil Bailey called mimetic existence. We like to imitate others in what they desire. For instance, I'm over here, I'm not really interested in that candle at all, until you say, isn't that candle just beautiful? I would give anything to have that candle. And I said, oh yeah? I think I want that candle as well. It happens with kids, it happens everywhere. I don't remember if you remember what that candid camera, Alan Funk, he had 3 kids on the show. And he had 1 ice cream cone. And he gave this little girl this ice cream cone, and these 2 boys on either side of her were badgering her for that ice cream. Absolutely. Wanted that ice cream. And finally, she gave him a lick, and he ate the whole thing. So the next week, they put the same 3 on, and they gave the boy the ice cream cone, never gave it to the girl for a lick. The other thing that we do, because of mimetic desire, what we want, and the desires that we want to achieve, is we begin to scapegoat people. Scapegoating becomes the mentality in the competitive field and also in the satisfaction of our particular desires. Blaming rather than owning. Demonizing the other as the source of the evil and the upset in the community. When it isn't going the way we want it to go, we pick somebody out and we put that emphasis on that person and want to bully that person, beat that person up, and ultimately spill the blood. We just had the anniversary of Jasper, didn't we? Okay, that's a perfect example. What about this other kid in school recently, just yesterday on the radio, where the one boy was gay and the other one was not gay, and he killed him, right smack in the classroom. Put a bullet through his head. We see each other who are others who are different from what we are, others who are impeding us from achieving what we want, or others who are threatening us because they reflect something about us that we don't want to take into consideration, and what it calls forth is a kind of a violent reaction on us. The other thing that happens in this kind of mentality is that people become disposable and dispensable. If we want to achieve what we want to achieve because of our own self-interest, other people become disposable and dispensable. So, what are some of the other experiences of the hard surfaces that we see in our culture? What I call the scabs on the wounds to stop the bleeding, okay? No-fault divorce, no-fault existence, irreconcilable differences, and we split. Just think a little bit about no-fault divorce, which leads over to sense of no-fault existence. If you have no fault, you don't have to ask for any reconciliation. You don't have to ask for forgiveness. You simply go there with the most economical ways. It's very simple. You just simply declare that you want to split, and you split. There are no responsibilities, and there is nothing there that you have to enter into by way of trying to even seek reconciliation. When we talk about irreconcilable differences, we say that we cannot be reconciled. There is no basis here. We may even have tried, but even our best efforts don't bring us to that reconciliation. What about road rage? I mean, we laugh at road rage. And I have to say that I have that tendency not to laugh, but to road rage. What's really happening in that situation is that we do not have a sense of community. We want what the other wants. We want the place that the other has. We want the same speed as the other had. We want to pass them up and get beyond them, and we find ourselves once again in a competitive state. What about rights talk and rights conflict? We use the court system to try to make the bleeding stop. We have an absence of a sense of co-creating life. If you're there all by yourself and you're focused on yourself, there's no need to enter into a relationship which would create life together. Why would we even think of seeking the common good? There doesn't seem to be any common good, so why should we seek the good in common? Why should we even seek to build community? Community only exists to keep in balance these different individual interests and different individual self-interests. Our lives become lives of criticizing rather than contemplating the truth and the beauty of existence and other people. We become sarcastic and we become cynical. And then we begin to avoid relationships because of the fear of pain. And finally, how do we live? We like to take solo flights rather than see anything having to do with a crew operation. And then we fall into the category of political correctness, because there is no way of looking at standards and nothing over which we should be reconciled or forgiven. What are our famous phrases? Keep the peace, don't go there, let it go. All of which say there is no engagement even in seeking the truth about the situation, how I would have to change, how you may have to change, and how we may have to come to a common life. So these are ways of avoiding reconciliation with the self, and therefore we avoid reconciliation with others. The main point I want to make here is that given our cultural mindset, which on the one hand raises the individual and manifests individual dignity, on the other hand shortchanges the individual because it limits the understanding of the person as created for relationships, as created for community, and always having the necessity to engage in that activity which brings about forgiveness and reconciliation and ultimately even showing mercy. Mercy, which is that kind of love which goes to the other even when the other does not deserve it. It's different from compassion. In compassion, you can go and you can feel with the other. You can be with the other. But when we seek mercy, which is at the heart of forgiveness, when we seek mercy, which is at the heart of reconciliation, it's given because of a self-donation for the other, even when the other does not merit it. Now, Maureen is going to go into some wonderful examples later on about how this works out in married life and relationships and in various ways in our culture. But what I'm trying to focus on here is that we put such a high value on the individual that we forget that we have to function in a community, and our relations go beyond that which is merely contractual, where you give and I give as long as it suits us, and when we don't, we break the contract and go off to something else. So that it leads up to a mentality where you don't necessarily have to have either mercy or forgiveness or reconciliation.
I'm going to spend a little bit of time on some work that I've done over the years with you now. Some of you have seen it because you've taken the course and you've seen this, but bear with me. I go over it all the time and I always get something further out of it than I think. The more repetitious it becomes, then the more you understand. And this particular presentation was done by one of my former students, Don Zook. You did that. You did this. You put this together over here. He even put my picture on there. I would never have put my picture. Okay? Now, keep in mind, the one thing that will give us happiness is to become loving people. To the extent that a way of life, a culture, helps us to do that, it's fostering our coming to the fullness of humanity. To the extent that a way of life or a culture does not do that, it is impeding us from becoming who God wants us to be. St. Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O God. Every culture offers some opportunities for loving, and every culture impedes the loving process in some way because they, as I said to you before, because they are human constructs, and in being human constructs, they reflect all of the goodness and all of the weakness in human nature and people. Okay? So that's what we look at in American culture as well. With its focus on the individual, it really gives us a wonderful sense of human dignity. But on the other hand, it limits us and turns us back in ourselves. St. Paul best grasps this struggle in his epistle to the Galatians, where he's talking about freedom and so forth, and how we use this freedom to engage in love. Okay? He said, you're called to be free. Don't use your freedom as an opening for self-indulgence. There is the point. Are we going to live in a self-indulgent way, or are we going to live in a self-donating way? And then he contrasts self-indulgence with life in the Spirit, which is the heart of Christian spiritual life. Be guided by the Spirit, and you will no longer yield to self-indulgence. The desires of self-indulgence are always in opposition to the Spirit. By the way, in some of the other translations of this, don't give into the flesh. Okay, everybody thought that was sex all the time. Okay, it's more than that. It is truly whether we are impeded in transcending ourselves in love, or we're locked in ourselves in our own little worlds, and we can't get out of our own little worlds. So we're always looking at how the culture is enabling us to participate and relate to others in community. Listen to what he says when we're living a self-indulgence or a self-interested life, wrongly understood. He says, when self-indulgence is at work, the results are obvious. Sexual vice, impurity and sensuality, the worship of false gods and sorcery, antagonisms and rivalry, jealousy, bad habits, bad temper and quarrels, disagreements, factions and malice, drunkenness, orgies and all such things. On the other hand, he talks about the desires of self-indulgence on the one hand, and he talks about the fruit of the Spirit is love, peace, joy, patience, kindness, goodness, trustfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There can no law can touch such things as these. So what we're doing is looking at the American way of life, and to what extent it is going to help us reach out mercifully to other people, help us to engage in reconciliation, foster a sense of forgiveness, and help us always to try to go and find ways to reconcile and bring conflict to a minimum. Does it do that, or doesn't it do that? One of the principal weaknesses is in the way that the American way of life looks at the person. I told you about the vision, okay? The vision of the human person. So let's see how it contrasts with a Christian understanding of the human person. I hope I pressed the right button. There's a lot behind this. I can't go into it all here. But yeah, you can give that out now. I have these two columns that I've developed, and those of you who took my course understand these columns. But when you look at this, you're going to begin to understand how all the emphasis on the individual tends to, I will just say tends to, I believe it's stronger than tends to, and I believe that it does, make it difficult for us to understand reconciliation, forgiveness, mercy, and also contributes to the roots of violence in our lives, the roots of spilling other people's blood for what we want in self-indulgence and self-interest. Okay? Why? Basically, we as Americans look at the human person as almost pre-social. In other words, we're almost not born of a woman. It's like we fell out of heaven and we're here. And once we're here, we have to figure out there are some other people who fell out of heaven too, and how are we going to put this thing together? Well, we have to have some checks and balances, and we have to watch out. Otherwise, this could become, hell against, one against all, and all against one, instead of one for all and one for, and all for one. That we have to become the self-created people, and that's a very individualized and personal thing. And finally, that I ultimately am the seat of all authority and agency in my life. Okay? Now, how is that contrasted with what we would call Catholic or Christian? The human person is created by an all-loving God who is the author of all creation. The person is essentially relational and social. In other words, we will not find happiness except in good, loving relationships. We're created for good, loving relationships. And to the extent that we enter into good, loving relationships, and we are doing everything to foster good, loving relationships when they seem to be broken, or when they are fractured, or when they are falling apart, what do we need to do that? We need to have a merciful love which is going to seek reconciliation through forgiveness. Society is broken, and we are broken to the extent that our relationships, our loving relationships, are broken. When you understand that you are relational, and that the family, for instance, is the ultimate fundamental cell of society in which you learn this, that we all in life are in a school of love. Life becomes a school of love and loving, giving us the opportunity through our relationships to learn what it means to be self-donating instead of self-centered, because our ultimate goal is union with God and union with one another. And it's in this union with God, in sharing the life of God within us, His love, His grace, that we ultimately find the fullness of what it means to be a human being. We cannot look at anybody else except as someone else with whom we should be relating lovingly. And because of that, our attention, our awareness, our focus is heightened in such a way that we will do everything possible to become peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. That's one of the Beatitudes. Do we really take it seriously? It is of the essence of understanding what it means to be a full human being, a person fully alive. The focus has to be on peacemaking and not peace breaking. It has to be on our ability to understand when it is broken and how we have to seek forgiveness and admit that we are not the ultimate authors of ourselves. God is the authority, the one who is the author of all. We are not self-created. We take our gifts and recognize what God can do through us with our gifts, rather than simply focus on our gifts, which must be used for self-interest. Is this contrast beginning to come up? I want you to begin to feel it. I want you to begin to think in your mind, where have I experienced this? Have I experienced this someplace? Where people have no idea at all that they want to come together, or that they have to heal the brokenness of their relationships? Or is it always about me? In the contractual business world, you are not going to find forgiveness and reconciliation. You won't find that there. You are not going to find mercy. You're working with a whole other set of values and expected patterns of behavior. And it's those expected patterns of behavior which flow over to us in our cultural setting. They drive us, and we do not drive them. So we also always have to go back and look at this understanding of the fullness of what it means to be a human person. The person is essentially relational and social. It is not good for man to be alone. And this is why he leaves his father and his mother, and he and his wife become one. The major metaphor in the Christian perception of the human person is the covenant and matrimony. To become one. One flesh. Over there. Okay. Let's look at the fallout on this, and you test it over against your own experience, because I'm just proposing it, okay? Where do we see the authority then? Well, in the American attitude is, I judge for myself everything that I have to do. I'm in control of everything. And then everybody realizes they're out of control, and they begin to join AA. And truth. Ultimately, I will decide what is the truth. Based on what? Perhaps reason, perhaps irrationality, perhaps on my feelings, perhaps on everything that I want, perhaps on uncontrolled desires. Your feelings become your truth. That only in you become the whole center of that. When you actually understand that you are created by God, God is the source of all authority and truth. The self-revelation in time and history through events, people, and the incarnation. That is the source of truth besides reason. So that reason and revelation, faith, have to go together. You don't have a complete picture unless you have faith and reason together. And once you begin to forget that God is the author of all and the author of ultimate truth, you have put it back on yourself. And then you become like Atlas. You're trying to hold up this whole world. It's weighing you down, and the world is empty. There's nothing in that world, okay? Where do we go for truth? This follows with the authority again. It's discovered through reason and only empirically. Where Catholic truth is discovered both through faith and reason. They come together to give us a full understanding of who we are and what we are destined for. What about immediacy? Well, the individual's internal, immediate experience and as a source of all religion. I'm going to go into myself. They talk about the religion of Sheilaism. Sheilaism is somebody who says, this woman in the Habits of the Heart of Robert Bellah, who simply says to myself, well, I create my own religion. And when you meet young people and they tell you, no, I'm very spiritual, but I'm not religious. That's what they mean. Means that they go into themselves, and that is really where they're going to find the basis for anything that they really believe. It has to be immediate, without mediation from you, from any institution, such as family, church, school. It's only in me. In a Catholic perception, everything is mediated. God is mediated through creation. God is mediated through faith. God is mediated through institutions such as the family, such as the church, such as school and education. Truth is mediated. Americans live contractual lives based on self-interest. I give, that you give. And as long as we can both meet the terms of the contract, we will continue on with that. When we decide that the contract no longer satisfies what we desire and what we are seeking, we break the contract and we leave. This is what I call the contractual mentality. So if you are in a contractual mentality, is there necessity for reconciliation, forgiveness, and mercy? Could be, but most often not. You just split. And this contractual mentality pervades down into the most sacred of relationships, such as marriage. It becomes contractual. You have an antenuptial agreement. You know that down the line when you're going to be leaving each other, you want to make sure that the goods are there and they're going to be split, and she can't get what I have and he can't get what I have, and we'll be able to do this in a nice way, no fault, so we take off. In a Christian perception of reality, all of life is covenantal. In other words, all of life is relational. And that relationship has its ups and downs. We know that just with the Jews and the Hebrews in the Old Testament. All the times that God enters into covenant with them and keeps faithful to the covenant, and they manifest their infidelity to the covenant, they go and worship false gods, whatever shape and form those false gods take, and therefore they have to come back, and just as David in Psalm 51 says, "Have mercy on me, O God, in your kindness, and wipe out my offense. Wash me. Make me clean. Help me to enter back into the community." And at the end of that psalm, he comes back into the community, okay, for his worship. Americans place heavy emphasis on inalienable individual rights. And from a Christian point of view, we would be looking to the Beatitudes and the Ten Commandments as the institutions which define our responsibility and also define our rights in life. Because what we have to respect, others have to respect in us. This is relational. Can they be broken? They are broken. Are they offended? They are offended. Do we find ourselves in a fractured community? We do. What do we need? Mercy, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Institutions. We live by institutions. We are formed by institutions. You're formed by your family. You're formed by your school. You're formed by your church. Those are institutions. We're formed by our legal system. We're formed by our governmental system. We're formed by our economic system in this country. Everything shapes us as to how we understand ourselves to be human beings. But in the American mentality, we all say, got to get away from institutions to be myself. I have to get out of my family. They have ruined me. Okay, I got to get out of this school. It's shaping me in this way. And as far as church is concerned, please don't impose anything on me. Don't expect me to buy into that creed. Don't expect me to come over here and respect, the regulations for marriage. And besides, why do I have to be baptized in order to be married in a church? Blah blah blah. It goes all over the place. Okay, so you don't need institutions. Institutions in the American mentality impede you from being yourself. However, if you don't need institutions, it means you don't need to relate to people. And if you don't need to relate to people, why should you even try to enter into relationships which are going to build up the community? Is this making sense? Okay. Let's see what we have from a Christian point of view. We see institutions as educative. And by that, but what I mean by that is they bring you up, they shape you, they form you. Education as a formative process. The church, which is forming you into a body. Listen to the terminology that Christianity uses for Christ himself. The church as the body of Christ, where everything is interrelated, as St. Paul says, where all the gifts come together for the building up of the body. That's what it is, okay? You would need reconciliation there, because we always fall down. We'll always harm the other. We always become impediments to their formation and their education. And therefore, you're constantly seeking reconciliation. The church, the result of human decision in a social contract, or the church as Christ, the people of God. Americans, here's a big one. And this goes right to the heart of the matter. Americans prefer to live in lifestyle communities. I mean, lifestyle enclaves, not communities. Why? Because they're living in a group that thinks like they do, acts like they do, desires like as they do, and wants what they want. A community is diversity. You have everybody in the mix. You have to live with difference and pluralism. You have to take this and put it all together and hold it together. And in order to hold it together, you have to have a lot of mercy. You have to have a lot of reconciliation. You have to have a lot of forgiveness. You have to be able to stick with it and hold it in your arms. Lifestyle enclaves do not demand that, because you don't want difference. You want everybody to be the same as you are. And that's why we find division rather than e pluribus unum, from the many, one. We find that we are living many ones around rather than that which will hold us together. These kinds of mentalities, therefore, don't make you stretch for reconciliation. Don't make you stretch for forgiveness. And I'll be done in 5 minutes. And don't let you even look for a conflict resolution. In a Catholic sense, community or communio, you have to have a communio of memory. You have to have a community of memory, which this doesn't permit over here. In this, you very often think that you came out of nowhere and life begins with you. Nothing existed before, nor do you have to go back into the communal memory to give you some sense of where you're coming from or where you are going. God is communio, Father, Son, and Spirit. One God, relational, communio, manifesting total mutual relationship and calling us to that same union. Remember, the goal of Christ's ministry is this: may they all be one, Father, as you are in me and I am in you. May they be so completely one that the world will recognize that I love them as much as you love me. Okay? In the communio, you're going to have to do a lot of work to maintain communio, because the pull of self-interest, the pull of self-indulgence is very strong. To come back over to living in the Spirit, whose fruits are love, peace, joy, magnanimity, and generosity, and so forth, is constantly the task of the Christian. Baptism is an altar call. In the Catholic sense, it's a baptism as an act of Christ through the church, incorporating the person into his body. The church exists before the individual or the person. The person born is incorporated into that and learns mercy, reconciliation, forgiveness. Individualism is a virtue for our way of life. For as a Catholic, egoism is a vice. It's selfishness. Americans live by self-interest and self-indulgence, what St. Augustine called cupiditas. As a Christian, we are called to caritas, agape, and sacrificial love. Americans look for democracy and egalitarianism. As a Christian, we look for life as participative, much deeper than a governmental structure would give us by way of participating in a democracy. I'm going over these quickly because I have to end. And ultimately, we look for freedom. We look for justice, which is very limited in, let me go on this one a little bit. Justice in the American cultural system is legal and contractual. Okay? So, you're only looking at justice from that point of view. From a Catholic point of view, it is legal, distributed, commutative, and most of all, it begins with God. It is redemptive. And this redemptive love of God is His mercy. It is God's mercy which brings about reconciliation. And God, in bringing about reconciliation, brings about His justice in the world, which is right relationship between and among all people. Redemptive justice, as St. Paul calls us, this is justice, is pure gift. God's loving mercy coming to us and giving us the capacity to live in community as brothers and sisters, to be repeatedly reconciled, to have the power to forgive, and to live in peace. The first effect of covenantal relationship, reconciled, forgiven, merciful love, the first effect is peace. And that's the challenge. That is the challenge. Success is not the achievement of material goods and power. Success is seeing the face of God. And I think that's it. And I think they're telling me I have to keep quiet. So try to chew on that for a little bit. I did it very fast, but we spent a lot more time on it in the class. But I really believe that with this, we have done such a wonderful job in focusing on the dignity of the individual. But we have to shift to the dignity of the human person to get the fullest understanding of what will give us happiness, how we get there, and how much we are in need of reconciliation and forgiveness, not spilling the blood of other people, but making a donation of our own blood as Christ did on the cross. Okay? And he also taught at the University of St. Thomas. And he's a confrere of mine, my religious congregation, which is a congregation of the Holy Spirit. He's now stationed in Taiwan. He has been totally immersed in Chinese for the past 3 years. And I can only tell you, I stand in amazement at his being not only able to speak, but he writes it. Wow. He writes Chinese and all these kind of things. So,
He's talking Chinese.
well, he may do a little bit on a couple of the characters later on. I think that, but he's going to be. We're letting him take over here to look at atonement and at one-ment and blood being shed against life and for life in the scriptures and in theology.